Martha Reynolds wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stepped off the bus. Her knees ached from scrubbing floors all week, and her back wasn't doing much better. She was 62 years old, and some days she felt every single year of it. The Sunday morning sun was already warm, even though it was barely 9 o'clock. In her hand, she carried a small bouquet of daisies wrapped in brown paper. They weren't fancy flowers from an expensive shop. She'd bought them from the corner store for $3, the same as she did every single Sunday. The walk from the bus stop to Oakwood Cemetery took about 10 minutes. Martha had made this journey so many times now that her feet knew the way without her even thinking about it. 3 years. That's how long she'd been coming here. Rain or shine, hot or cold. People probably thought she was crazy, spending her hard-earned money on flowers when she could barely pay her rent. But they didn't understand. They couldn't understand. The cemetery gates were already open when she arrived. Old Mr. Wilson, the groundskeeper, was trimming the hedges near the entrance. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Morning, Mrs. Reynolds," he called out, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Right on time, as always." Martha smiled back. "Morning, Tommy. How are those grandkids of yours doing?" "Growing like weeds," he chuckled. "The youngest one just started walking. Can you believe it?" "Time flies," Martha said softly. "It really does." She made her way along the familiar path, her shoes crunching on the gravel. The cemetery was peaceful at this hour. A few other people were scattered around, tending to their loved ones' graves, but mostly it was quiet. Just the sound of birds singing and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Martha liked it this way. It gave her time to think, to remember, to feel. Her husband's grave was in the older section of the cemetery, near a large oak tree. She stopped there first, like she always did. The headstone was simple. Robert Reynolds, loving husband, 1955-2020. 5 years he'd been gone now. Sometimes it felt like yesterday, and sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago. "Hey, Bobby," she said quietly, crouching down to pull a few weeds that had sprouted around the base of the stone. "I'm here again. I know, you'd probably tell me I'm being silly, spending money on flowers for strangers. But you always did say I had too big a heart for my own good." She sat there for a few minutes just being present. That's what the grief counselor had told her to do after Bobby died. Be present with your feelings. Don't run from them. Martha hadn't been sure about therapy at first. It seemed like something for rich people with fancy problems. But the community center offered it for free, and her neighbor had convinced her to go. It had helped, she had to admit. Not that the pain ever really went away. You just learned to carry it differently. After a while, Martha stood up, her knees protesting again. She needed to get some of that cream from the pharmacy, the one that was supposed to help with joint pain. But that would have to wait until she got paid next week. For now, she had somewhere else to be. She walked across the cemetery past rows and rows of headstones. Some were elaborate, with angels and crosses and long epitaphs about beloved family members. Others were simple, just a name and dates. Each one represented a life, a story, people who had loved and been loved. At least that's what Martha hoped. Finally, she reached the spot she'd been coming to for 3 years. The grave was in a newer section of the cemetery, where the grass was still working on filling in completely. The headstone was made of gray granite, simple but elegant. It read, "Elizabeth Chen, beloved daughter, 1985-2021. Martha knelt down beside the grave, her knees cracking as she did. She carefully unwrapped the daisies and arranged them in the small vase that sat at the base of the headstone. Someone had put that vase there long ago, probably when Elizabeth was first buried, but Martha was the one who kept it filled. "Good morning, sweetheart," Martha said, her voice gentle. "I brought your favorite again. I hope you don't mind that they're not the fanciest ones. You know me, I'm working with what I've got." This probably seemed strange to anyone watching. Martha had never met Elizabeth Chen. Didn't know her when she was alive, didn't know her family, didn't know anything about her except what was written on that cold stone. But that was exactly why Martha came. It had started 3 years ago, not long after Bobby died. Martha had been visiting his grave, feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. On her way out, she'd noticed this particular headstone. There were no flowers on it, no decorations. No signs that anyone had visited in a long time. Week after week, Martha would pass by and see the same thing. Nothing. Just an empty grave with a name that nobody seemed to remember. It had broken something in Martha's heart. The thought of this young woman, only 36 years old when she died, lying here with no one to visit her, no one to bring her flowers, no one to sit and talk to her. It felt wrong. It felt cruel in a way Martha couldn't quite explain. So one Sunday she'd bought an extra bunch of flowers, just cheap ones from the grocery store, and she'd placed them on Elizabeth Chen's grave. The next week she did it again, and the week after that, and somehow, without really planning it, it became part of her routine. "You know what happened this week?" Martha said, settling herself more comfortably on the grass. Her cleaning uniform from Friday was still in her bag. She'd have to wash it tonight for tomorrow's shift. "Mrs. Patterson, you remember I told you about her? The lady on the 3rd floor with all the cats? Well, she finally went to the doctor about that cough she's had. Turns out it's just allergies, thank goodness. We were all worried it might be something serious." Martha talked to Elizabeth like this every week. Told her about work, about the neighbors, about the little dramas and joys of everyday life. It made her feel less lonely, honestly. And she liked to think that maybe somehow Elizabeth could hear her, that maybe she wasn't so alone either. The Ramirez family downstairs had their baby. Martha continued, adjusting the flowers so they sat just right. A little girl, 8 pounds 2 ounces. They named her Sophia. She's got the loudest cry you've ever heard, but she's beautiful. Mrs. Ramirez let me hold her yesterday, and oh, Elizabeth, she's just perfect. Made me think about how precious life is, you know? How we should appreciate every single day we get. A butterfly landed on one of the daisies, its wings opening and closing slowly. Martha watched it, smiling. "Bobby and I never had kids," she said quietly. "We tried for years, but it just wasn't meant to be. I used to be so sad about it, especially when I was younger. But Bobby would always say that we had each other, and that was enough." And it was. It really was. She paused, her throat getting tight the way it always did when she talked about her husband. "I miss him, Elizabeth. God, I miss him so much sometimes I can barely breathe. 40 years we were married. 40 years of waking up next to the same person, of knowing exactly how they take their coffee, of finishing each other's sentences. And then one day he's gone, just like that. Heart attack while he was watching the game on TV. The doctor said he probably didn't feel any pain, that it was quick. I guess that's supposed to make me feel better, but it doesn't. Not really." A cool breeze picked up, rustling the leaves of a nearby tree. Martha closed her eyes and let it wash over her. These moments, sitting here in the quiet, talking to someone who couldn't talk back, they'd become important to her, more important than she'd ever expected. "I wonder about you sometimes," Martha said, opening her eyes and looking at the headstone. "What were you like? Were you funny? Were you kind? What did you do for a living? Did you have dreams that you never got to finish? The stone says beloved daughter, so at least someone loved you. But where are they now? Why doesn't anyone come to see you?" It was a mystery that bothered Martha more than she liked to admit. In 3 years, she'd never seen anyone else visit this grave. Not once. No fresh flowers except the ones she brought. No cards, no trinkets, no signs of life. Just that simple stone and the dates that marked such a short life. "Maybe your family moved away," Martha mused. "Or maybe it hurts them too much to come here. I get that. For the first year after Bobby died, I could barely make myself come to the cemetery. It felt like admitting he was really gone, you know? Like as long as I didn't see that headstone with his name on it, maybe it wasn't real." She reached out and brushed some dirt off the stone, her touch gentle. "But you deserve to be remembered, Elizabeth Chen. Everyone does. It doesn't matter if I knew you or not. You were here. You lived. You mattered. And as long as I'm able, I'm going to make sure you're not forgotten." Mr. Wilson appeared on the path nearby, pushing a wheelbarrow full of tools. He waved when he saw Martha, then came over. "Doing your good deed for the week, I see," he said kindly. He'd asked her about it once, a couple years back, why she tended a stranger's grave. Martha had told him the truth, and he'd just nodded like it made perfect sense. She appreciated that about Tommy Wilson. He didn't judge. "Someone's got to do it," Martha said, using his offered hand to help her stand up. Her knees really were getting worse. "You know," Tommy said thoughtfully, "I've been working here for 30 years and I've seen a lot of things. But I've never seen anyone do what you do. Most people can barely remember to visit their own family members. But you come here every single week for someone you never even met." Martha shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just flowers, Tommy, nothing special." "It's more than that, and you know it," he said firmly. "You're keeping her memory alive. That's not nothing." After Tommy moved on to his work, Martha spent a few more minutes at the grave. She straightened up the area, pulling a few weeds, making sure everything looked nice. It was strange how protective she'd become of this little plot of ground, like it was her responsibility now. "I should get going," she finally said to Elizabeth. "I've got to get to the store before it gets too crowded. You know how I hate crowds, but I'll be back next week, same as always. I promise you that, sweetheart. Rain or shine, hot or cold, I'll be here." She touched the top of the headstone one last time, a gesture that had become habit. Then she picked up her bag and started the walk back to the bus stop. Her shift at the office building started at 6 tomorrow morning. She cleaned 5 floors by herself, mopping and vacuuming and scrubbing toilets for 8 hours straight. It wasn't glamorous work and it didn't pay much, but it was honest. And at her age, she was grateful to have any job at all. As the bus pulled up and Martha climbed aboard, she thought about Elizabeth Chen, about a life cut short at 36. About all the Sundays stretching ahead, all the flowers she would bring, all the one-sided conversations she would have. Some people might think it was sad or strange, but to Martha it felt right. It felt like purpose. And in a life that had seen its share of loss and loneliness, purpose was something worth holding on to, even if it came in the form of $3 daisies and a grave that belonged to a stranger. The rain started just as Martha was leaving her apartment. She looked up at the dark clouds and sighed. Of course it would rain today. She'd checked the weather last night, and they'd said it would be clear until afternoon. But weather forecasters were wrong more often than they were right, at least in Martha's experience. She grabbed her old umbrella from the stand by the door. It was missing a spoke and had a tendency to flip inside out when the wind picked up, but it was better than nothing. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Elizabeth as far as Martha knew, poked her head out of her apartment. "You're not going to that cemetery in this weather, are you?" she asked, shaking her head. "Martha, you're going to catch your death of cold." "I've got an umbrella," Martha said, holding it up as proof. "Besides, I promised. Rain or shine, remember?" Mrs. Chen muttered something in Mandarin that Martha didn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. She thought Martha was being foolish. Maybe she was. But a promise was a promise, even if it was a promise made to someone who couldn't hear it. The bus was nearly empty on the ride to the cemetery. Most people had the good sense to stay home on a day like this. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the windows and turning the streets into rivers. Martha watched the water rush along the gutters and thought about how Bobby used to love rainy days. He'd make hot chocolate and they'd sit on the couch watching old movies. She could almost smell the chocolate, almost hear his laugh. By the time she reached Oakwood Cemetery, she was already damp despite the umbrella. Her shoes squelched with each step, and she could feel the cold water seeping through to her socks. The daisies she'd bought were getting beaten down by the rain, their white petals drooping sadly. She'd wrapped them in plastic at the store, but it wasn't doing much good now. The cemetery looked different in the rain, darker somehow, lonelier. There was no one else around, not even Mr. Wilson. He was probably smart enough to stay in his little maintenance shed until the storm passed. Martha made her way along the muddy path, holding her umbrella against the wind that kept trying to tear it from her hands. She stopped at Bobby's grave first, like always. The flowers she'd brought last week were completely destroyed by the weather, just brown stems and shredded petals. She'd have to clean that up next time. "Sorry I can't stay long today, Bobby," she said, raising her voice a bit over the sound of the rain. "But I'll come back next week when it's nicer." "I promise." Then she headed toward Elizabeth's grave. Her feet were completely soaked now, and she was starting to shiver. Maybe Mrs. Chen had been right. Maybe this was foolish. But she was already here and she'd brought the flowers, and turning back now seemed worse than just pushing through. As she got closer to Elizabeth's grave, Martha saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. There was someone there, a man standing in front of the headstone. In 3 years, 3 whole years of coming here every single Sunday, Martha had never seen another person at this grave. Not once. The man was tall, probably in his mid-40s, wearing what looked like an expensive suit that was now completely soaked. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't seem to care about the rain at all. He was just standing there, his shoulders shaking, and Martha realized with a start that he was crying. She froze, unsure what to do. Should she leave? Should she come back later? This was clearly a private moment, and she didn't want to intrude. But she'd also come all this way in the pouring rain. And part of her, a part she wasn't entirely proud of, was desperately curious about who this man was and why he was here. While she was still trying to decide, the man turned around. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, and his face was wet with rain and tears mixed together. He looked at Martha, then at the flowers in her hands, and something crossed his face. Recognition, surprise? She couldn't quite tell. You, he said, his voice hoarse. You've been leaving these. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Martha nodded slowly, clutching her bouquet of bedraggled daisies. I'm sorry, she started to say. I didn't mean to intrude. I can come back another time. No, the man said quickly, holding up his hand. Please, don't go. They stood there for a moment, rain pouring down around them, two strangers at a grave. Martha's umbrella chose that moment to finally flip inside out with a sharp crack. She wrestled with it for a second, then gave up and let it hang useless at her side. The man took a step closer. He was looking at the daisies like they were something precious, like they held answers to questions Martha didn't know he was asking. Daisies were her favorite, he said softly. Elizabeth. She loved daisies. Simple flowers, she used to say. Honest flowers. Martha felt her heart start to pound. You knew her, she said. It came out as a whisper. Knew her? The man let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so full of pain. She was my wife. Martha felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. His wife. Elizabeth Chen had been this man's wife. All this time, all these years of wondering who Elizabeth was and why no one visited. And here was her husband standing in front of her, soaking wet and crying in the rain. I don't understand, Martha said. I've been coming here for 3 years. Every single Sunday, and I've never seen anyone. Not you, not anyone else. Where have you been? The words came out sharper than she intended, almost accusatory, but the man didn't seem offended. Instead, he just looked down at the ground, shame written all over his face. I couldn't, he said simply. I couldn't make myself come here. Too much guilt. Too much pain. So I just didn't. But she was your wife, Martha said, still trying to wrap her head around this. How could you not visit your own wife's grave? The man looked up at her, and the raw agony in his eyes made Martha take a step back. Because it's my fault she's dead, he said, his voice breaking. Because I was too busy building my empire to notice she was dying. Because by the time I pulled my head out of my work long enough to really look at her, it was too late. That's why. The rain kept falling. Martha's clothes were completely soaked through now, and she was shivering hard. But she couldn't seem to make herself move. This man, this stranger, had just cracked himself open in front of her, and she didn't know what to do with that kind of pain. I'm sorry, she finally said. I shouldn't have. I didn't know. No, I'm sorry, the man said, wiping his face with his hand even though the rain just kept washing more tears down. You've been taking care of her grave all this time. You, a stranger, while I couldn't even bring myself to show up? What does that say about me? Martha didn't have an answer for that. She stood there holding her ruined daisies, looking at this broken man in his expensive suit, and felt a wave of something she couldn't quite name. Not pity, exactly. Something deeper than that. What's your name? She asked. James, he said. James Chen. I'm Martha. Martha Reynolds. They stood there introducing themselves like they were meeting at a coffee shop instead of a cemetery in a thunderstorm. It would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. Can I ask you something, Martha? James said. Why? Why have you been leaving flowers here? Elizabeth was a complete stranger to you. You didn't know her, didn't owe her anything. So why? Martha looked down at the daisies in her hands. They were a mess now, petals falling off, stems bent. But they were still daisies. Still honest flowers. Because nobody else was, she said simply. I'd walk by here every week on my way to visit my husband's grave, and this spot was always empty. No flowers, no decorations, no sign that anyone remembered her. And that just seemed wrong to me. Everyone deserves to be remembered. Everyone deserves to have someone who cares, even if it's just some foolish old woman who buys cheap flowers once a week. James stared at her. You're not foolish, he said quietly. I don't even know what you are. An angel, maybe? Martha laughed at that, a short, sharp sound. I'm no angel, honey. I'm just a cleaning lady with too much time on her hands and a soft heart. My husband always said it would get me in trouble one day. Your husband, James said. He's buried here too? 5 years now, Martha said. Heart attack. Quick and sudden. 1 minute he was watching football on the couch, the next minute he was gone. The doctor said he probably didn't feel any pain, but I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I'm sorry, James said, and he sounded like he meant it. They fell quiet for a moment. The rain was starting to ease up a little, going from a downpour to just a steady drizzle. Martha's teeth were chattering now, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to get warm. James noticed. "You're freezing," he said. "There's a diner about a mile from here. Come on, let me buy you a cup of coffee at least. Hot chocolate, if you prefer. You look like you could use something warm." Martha started to protest to say she was fine, but James was already walking toward the cemetery gates. He turned back and looked at her. "Please, he said. "I need to talk to someone. And I think you might be the only person who would understand." Something in his voice got to her. Maybe it was the loneliness she heard there. The same loneliness she'd felt so many times herself. Or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, Martha found herself nodding. "Okay," she said. "Coffee sounds good." She placed the daisies on Elizabeth's grave, arranging them as best she could in the vase. They looked pathetic, beaten down by the storm, but they were there. That's what mattered. James watched her do it, and when she was done, he reached out and touched the headstone gently, just a brush of his fingers against the wet granite. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." The diner was called Rosie's, and it was one of those old-fashioned places with red vinyl booths and checkered floors. The waitress, a woman about Martha's age with kind eyes and tired feet, brought them coffee without even asking. She took one look at their soaked clothes and came back with a stack of napkins and 2 blankets that smelled like they'd been in storage. "You two look like drowned rats," she said, not unkindly. "Get yourselves dried off before you catch pneumonia." Martha wrapped the blanket around her shoulders gratefully. The diner was warm, almost too warm, but after standing in the rain for so long, it felt like heaven. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. James sat across from her, looking somehow smaller now than he had in the cemetery. He'd taken off his suit jacket and draped it over the back of the booth, but his white shirt was still plastered to him, and his hair was dripping onto his shoulders. He didn't seem to notice or care. "I don't know where to start," he said, staring down at his coffee. "Start wherever you need to," Martha said gently. "I'm in no hurry, so he did." And once he started talking, it all came pouring out like the rain outside, like he'd been holding it in for so long that the dam had finally broken. He told her about meeting Elizabeth in college. He'd been nobody then, just a kid from a poor family with big dreams and no money to make them happen. Elizabeth had been studying literature, working 2 jobs to pay her tuition. They'd met in the library, both reaching for the same book, and it had been like something out of a movie. "She believed in me," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I told her I wanted to start my own tech company, when everyone else said I was crazy, she just smiled and said, 'Okay, let's do it.' She worked 60 hours a week waitressing and doing data entry to help me get the business off the ground. Never complained once. Never said it was too hard or that I was asking too much." Martha listened, her heart aching for this man and the woman she'd never met but had come to care about anyway. And then the company took off. James continued. "We started making real money. Good money. More money than either of us had ever dreamed of. And that's when everything went wrong." He told her how success had changed him, how he'd become obsessed with the business, with growing it bigger and bigger, how he'd started working 16-hour days, traveling constantly, missing anniversaries and birthdays and quiet moments at home, how Elizabeth had tried to tell him, tried to get him to slow down, but he hadn't listened. "She got sick," James said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Breast cancer. Stage 1 when she first found it. But she didn't tell me right away. She said I was in the middle of a big merger and she didn't want to worry me. Can you believe that? She had cancer and she was worried about my business deal." Martha reached across the table and put her hand over his. She didn't say anything. What could she say? By the time I finally noticed something was wrong, really noticed, not just brushed off her being tired as stress or whatever excuse I made up, it was stage 4, metastatic. In her bones, her liver, her lungs. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lasted 5. A tear rolled down his cheek and he didn't bother to wipe it away. "I quit everything," he said. "Stepped back from the company, canceled all my meetings, spent every second with her. But it was too late. All those years I'd wasted chasing success and I couldn't get a single one of them back. She died in our bedroom holding my hand, telling me it was okay, that she forgave me. But I don't forgive myself. I'll never forgive myself." The waitress came by with refills. took one look at James's face and quietly backed away. When she was dying, James said, Elizabeth told me she wanted daisies at her funeral. She was very specific about it. Daisies, she said. Simple and honest like our love used to be. But I was so out of it, so destroyed that I forgot. At her funeral, there were roses and lilies and all these expensive flowers that she would have hated. And no daisies. Not a single one. He looked up at Martha then, his eyes meeting hers. So when I saw you today, holding those daisies, the flowers she actually wanted, the flowers I couldn't even remember to give her, it just about broke me all over again. You, a complete stranger, have been giving her what I couldn't, what I was too wrapped up in my own guilt to give. Martha squeezed his hand. It's not too late, James. You're here now. That's what matters, is it? He asked. Is it really? Yes, Martha said firmly, it is. Because love doesn't end when someone dies, and neither does the chance to honor them. Elizabeth knows you loved her. I'm sure of it. James looked at her for a long moment. How can you be so sure? Because you're here, Martha said simply. Because you finally found the courage to show up. That's not nothing, James, that's everything. They sat there in that diner for 2 more hours talking about life and death and grief and regret. Martha told him about Bobby, about the life they'd built together, about the hole he'd left behind when he died. James told her more about Elizabeth, about the woman she'd been before the sickness, about her laugh and her kindness and the way she'd always seen the best in everyone. By the time they left, the rain had stopped completely. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, sending shafts of light down onto the wet streets. James walked Martha to her bus stop and insisted on giving her his phone number. I'd like to visit her grave again, he said, if that's okay with you. Maybe next Sunday? Martha smiled. I'll be there. Same time as always. As the bus pulled away, Martha looked back and saw James still standing there watching her go. He looked different now. Lighter somehow. Like talking about Elizabeth, really talking about her instead of running from the pain, had eased something in him. And Martha realized that something had eased in her too. For 3 years she'd been caring for a stranger's grave, but Elizabeth Chen wasn't a stranger anymore. She was real now. She had a story, a life, a husband who loved her and missed her, and somehow that made everything Martha had been doing feel even more important. The flowers weren't just flowers anymore. They were a connection. A bridge between the living and the dead, between grief and healing, between a woman who couldn't let go and a man who'd been running for too long. Martha settled back in her seat, tired and still damp, but feeling more alive than she had in months. Next Sunday couldn't come soon enough. The next Sunday, Martha arrived at the cemetery at her usual time. She half expected James not to show up. People said a lot of things in emotional moments that they didn't really mean, but as she walked up the path toward Elizabeth's grave, she saw him there standing with his hands in his pockets, looking more casual than he had last week. He was wearing jeans and a simple blue shirt instead of that expensive suit. He looked younger somehow, more approachable. You came, Martha said, surprised despite herself. James turned and smiled. It was a small smile, sad around the edges but genuine. I said I would. Besides, I couldn't let you do all the work. He held up a bouquet of flowers. Daisies. Simple white daisies. Just like the ones Martha always brought. She felt something warm bloom in her chest. I didn't know where you usually buy them, James said, looking almost shy. I went to that fancy florist on Main Street, and the woman tried to sell me some elaborate arrangement with roses and orchids. Cost a fortune, but that didn't feel right. So I went to the corner store instead and got these. Is that okay? Martha laughed, a real laugh that felt good in her chest. That's perfect, James, that's exactly right. They arranged the flowers together, James learning from Martha how to place them in the vase just so, how to make sure they'd last as long as possible in the weather. It felt natural working side by side like this. Like they'd been doing it for years instead of this being only the second time they'd met. I've been thinking about what you said, James told her as they worked. About how love doesn't end when someone dies. About how it's not too late to honor her. And, Martha prompted gently. And I think you're right, James said. I've spent 3 years running from this, from her, from everything. And it hasn't made anything better. It's only made me more miserable. So I'm going to stop running. I'm going to start showing up the way I should have been doing all along. Martha patted his arm. That's good, honey. That's really good. They sat together on the grass, not saying much, just being present. Martha told him about her week, about Mrs. Ramirez's baby and how the little thing cried all night long. James told her about his company, about how he'd finally promoted his second-in-command to handle more of the day-to-day operations, so he wouldn't have to work such crazy hours anymore. "Life's too short," he said, looking at Elizabeth's headstone. "I learned that the hard way, but maybe it's not too late to start living differently." This became their routine. Every Sunday, rain or shine, Martha and James would meet at Elizabeth's grave. Sometimes they'd talk for hours, sitting on the grass or on the little bench nearby. Other times they'd just sit in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. Over the weeks and months, Martha learned more about James. She learned that he'd grown up poor, the son of immigrants who'd worked themselves to the bone to give him opportunities, that he'd been driven to succeed partly because he never wanted to be poor again, never wanted to feel that helplessness of not being able to afford basic things. But somewhere along the way, James admitted one particularly beautiful spring morning, "I forgot why I was doing it." It wasn't about taking care of Elizabeth anymore. It was about proving something. To myself, to the world, I don't know. And in the process of trying to prove I was somebody, I lost the person who'd believed I was somebody all along. Martha understood that kind of regret. She told James about her own regrets with Bobby, how she'd nagged him about his weight in the years before he died, always pushing him to eat healthier, to exercise more, how her last words to him had been, "Bobby, you really shouldn't have that third slice of pizza instead of 'I love you.' We all have things we wish we'd done differently," she said. "That's part of being human. The trick is not letting those regrets destroy what time we have left." James started changing in ways that Martha noticed but didn't comment on directly. He looked less tired, less worn down. He smiled more easily. He started talking about Elizabeth without that crushing weight of guilt in his voice, remembering the good times instead of just focusing on how it ended. One Sunday, James showed up with coffee and donuts for both of them. "I figured we could have a little breakfast picnic," he said. "If that's okay." Martha looked at the box of donuts, the fancy coffee from that expensive place downtown, and shook her head fondly. "James, you don't have to bring me things every week. The flowers are enough." "I know I don't have to," James said. "I want to. You've given me something I can never repay. At least let me buy you coffee." So they sat on the bench near Elizabeth's grave and ate donuts and drank coffee, and Martha thought about how strange life was. 6 months ago, she'd been alone with her grief and her flowers and her one-sided conversations with a dead woman. Now she had a friend. An unlikely friend, sure. A CEO and a cleaning lady didn't exactly move in the same circles, but a friend nonetheless. It was during one of these Sunday morning visits that Martha noticed James looking at her thoughtfully. "What?" she asked, brushing crumbs from her lap. "Where do you live, Martha?" James asked. "I've never asked." "Over on the east side," Martha said. "Little apartment building. Nothing fancy, but it's home. And you work as a cleaning lady." Martha bristled a little at his tone, though he didn't seem to mean anything by it. "Yes, I do. Someone's got to clean those office buildings, and it might as well be me. It's honest work." "I didn't mean anything by it," James said quickly. How much does that pay, if you don't mind me asking?" Martha did mind a little, but James had been so open with her about his own life that it seemed petty not to answer. "About $12 an hour. I work 40 hours a week, sometimes more if they need me. It's enough to get by." James was quiet for a moment. "How much is your rent?" "Why do you want to know?" Martha asked, getting suspicious now. "Just curious," James said, but there was something in his voice that made Martha think he was planning something. She didn't think much more about it until a few weeks later, when her landlord called her into his office. Mr. Peterson was a grumpy man in his 70s who owned the building and handled all the rent collections himself. He didn't like Martha much, mainly because she'd once complained about the broken heater in her apartment, and he'd had to actually fix something. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, looking at her over his reading glasses. "I need to talk to you about your rent." Martha's heart sank. Was he raising it again? She could barely afford what she was paying now. If he raised it, she'd have to find somewhere else to live, and good luck finding anything affordable in this city. "I know I paid on time this month," she said defensively. "I always pay on time." "It's not about that," Mr. Peterson said, looking confused himself. "It's been paid. For the whole year." "In advance," Martha stared at him. "What?" Someone paid your rent for the entire year, Mr. Peterson repeated, showing her a receipt. Anonymous payment came in through some lawyer's office. I thought maybe you'd know something about it. But Martha knew. Of course she knew. There was only one person who would do something like this. She marched to the cemetery that Sunday ready to give James a piece of her mind. But when she got there and saw him arranging his daisies next to hers, looking peaceful and content, the anger just drained right out of her. Why? She asked simply. James looked up and he had the grace to look a little embarrassed. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb with me, James Chen. My rent. For a whole year. Why would you do that? James stood up and brushed dirt off his jeans. Because I could. Because you've been spending your money on flowers for my wife instead of taking care of yourself. Because it's the least I could do. It's too much, Martha protested. I can't accept that. Why not? James asked. I have more money than I know what to do with, Martha. What's the point of having it if I can't use it to help someone who actually deserves help? I don't need charity, Martha said, her pride flaring up. It's not charity, James said firmly. It's friendship. It's gratitude. Call it whatever you want, but the rent's paid and I'm not taking it back, so you might as well accept it gracefully. They stood there glaring at each other for a moment, and then Martha felt her lips twitch. You're a stubborn man, James Chen. You're a stubborn woman, Martha Reynolds, he shot back. And just like that, they were laughing, the tension broken. But James wasn't done. A few weeks after that, Martha came home to find a letter taped to her door. It was from something called the Riverside Apartments, a newer building on the west side of town that Martha had walked past many times but never dreamed of living in. The letter informed her that she had been selected for a special housing program and had been approved for a 2-bedroom apartment at a reduced rate that was actually less than what she'd been paying. Mr. Peterson, she called James immediately. What did you do? I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but she could hear the smile in his voice. James. Okay, fine. The Riverside is owned by a friend of mine. I asked him to create a scholarship program for seniors who need better housing. You're the first recipient. It's completely legitimate, Martha. You applied and everything. I didn't apply for anything. Well, someone applied on your behalf. And you qualified, so really it would be rude not to accept. Think of all the other seniors who could benefit from this program if it works out well. Martha wanted to be angry. She really did. But the truth was her current apartment was falling apart. The heater barely worked. The plumbing was a disaster, and she was pretty sure there were mice in the walls. The idea of living somewhere nice, somewhere clean and safe was almost too tempting to resist. This is too much, she said weakly. It's not enough, James countered. Not for what you've done for me. Please, Martha. Let me do this. Let me help, so she moved. The new apartment was beautiful, with big windows that let in lots of light and a kitchen that actually had working appliances. She had a real bedroom now, not just a bed crammed into a corner of the main room. There was even a small balcony where she could sit and have her morning coffee. James helped her move, showing up with a truck and 3 young guys from his company who carried all her boxes without complaint. He didn't make a big deal out of it, didn't act like he was doing her some huge favor. He just helped, like friends do. Martha tried to pay him back in small ways. She started bringing him home-cooked meals on Sundays, things she'd made the night before. Pot roast and mashed potatoes, chicken soup, her famous apple pie. James ate everything like it was the best meal he'd ever had. Elizabeth used to cook like this, he told her one Sunday, scraping up the last bits of beef stew. Before she got sick, before things got so crazy. We'd have dinner together every night just talking about our days. I'd forgotten how much I missed that. How much I missed just being normal. You're welcome at my table anytime, Martha said. The new apartment has a proper dining room and everything, thanks to somebody I know. James grinned. I don't know what you're talking about. Their friendship deepened in ways Martha hadn't expected. James started calling her during the week just to chat. He'd tell her about problems at work, about difficult decisions he had to make, and Martha would listen and offer advice that came from decades of life experience. Sometimes he listened, sometimes he didn't, but he always seemed grateful for her perspective. Martha told him about her life too, about the other people in her apartment building, about the struggles of getting older, about her fears of becoming irrelevant or forgotten. James always listened without judgment, without trying to fix everything. Sometimes that's all anyone really needs, Martha thought. someone to listen. One Sunday, as they were sitting by Elizabeth's grave, James said something that surprised her. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," he said, "in Elizabeth's name. Something that helps people who are dealing with cancer, who can't afford treatment or who need support. I want to do something that matters, you know? Something she would have been proud of." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "James, that's beautiful. She would love that." "I want you to be part of it," James continued. "I want your input on how to really help people, not just throw money at problems. You understand what it's like to struggle, to need help. I don't want this to be some rich guy charity thing. I want it to actually make a difference." Martha didn't know what to say. She'd spent her whole life being invisible, just another cleaning lady that people walked past without seeing. And now here was James, asking for her help, valuing her opinion, treating her like she mattered. "I'd be honored," she finally managed to say. They started meeting during the week too, at coffee shops and restaurants, planning out the foundation. James brought in lawyers and accountants, but he always made sure Martha was part of every decision. She helped him understand what families really needed. Not just money for treatment, though that was important, but practical things too. Help with transportation to appointments, meal services for when people were too sick to cook, support groups for caregivers who were drowning in responsibility. Martha watched James come alive in a way she hadn't seen before. This was different from his business success. This mattered in a deeper way. This was about honoring Elizabeth, about turning his grief and guilt into something positive, something that would help others. "You know," Martha told him one day as they were reviewing foundation paperwork in her new apartment, "I think Elizabeth would be really proud of the man you've become." James looked up, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You think so?" "I know so," Martha said firmly. "You made mistakes, James, we all do. But you're not running anymore. You're facing it head on and trying to do better. That takes courage." James reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Martha. You know that, right? You saved me when I didn't even know I needed saving." Martha squeezed back. "And you gave me purpose when I thought my life was over. I guess we saved each other." They sat there for a moment, two unlikely friends brought together by grief and flowers and a grave in a cemetery. And Martha thought about how strange and beautiful life could be, how the worst moments could sometimes lead to the best things, how it was never too late to start over, to be better, to find meaning in the midst of loss. Elizabeth Chen had died too young, and that would always be a tragedy. But her death had brought Martha and James together, had sparked something good in the world. And maybe, just maybe, that was its own kind of miracle. On their next Sunday visit to the cemetery, Martha and James stood together by Elizabeth's grave, their weekly flowers arranged perfectly in the vase. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and everything felt right in a way it hadn't in a long time. "Thank you, Elizabeth," James whispered, touching the headstone. "Thank you for everything. For loving me when I didn't deserve it, for never giving up on me, and for somehow sending Martha into my life when I needed her most." Martha didn't say anything, just stood beside him in companionable silence. But in her heart she was saying thank you too. Thank you for letting her be part of this story, for giving her life meaning again, for the gift of this unexpected friendship. The daisies swayed gently in the breeze, simple and honest, just like Elizabeth had always wanted. The Elizabeth Chen Memorial Foundation officially launched on what would have been Elizabeth's 40th birthday. James had wanted to make it a big event, with press coverage and fancy speeches, but Martha had talked him out of it. Elizabeth wasn't about fancy events, she'd reminded him. She was about helping people quietly without making a fuss. Let's honor that. So instead, they had a small gathering at a community center on the east side of town. Just families who would benefit from the foundation's services, healthcare workers, and a few of James's employees who'd volunteered to help run the programs. Martha stood at the back of the room, watching James give a speech about his wife, about second chances, about turning grief into something meaningful. "None of this would exist without a woman named Martha Reynolds," James said, gesturing for her to come forward. "She taught me that showing up matters, that remembering people matters, that even the smallest act of kindness can change everything." Martha felt her face burn as everyone turned to look at her. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She'd spent her whole life in the background, cleaning up after other people, being invisible. But James was applauding, And then everyone else was too, and Martha found herself walking to the front of the room on shaky legs. James handed her the microphone. She looked out at all those faces and almost panicked. What was she supposed to say? She was just a cleaning lady. She didn't make speeches. But then she saw a woman in the third row, holding a little girl who was wearing a colorful headscarf to cover her bald head. The woman's eyes were tired but grateful, and Martha remembered why they were doing this. "I'm not good at fancy speeches," Martha started, her voice trembling a little. "I'm just an ordinary person who started leaving flowers on a grave. But I learned something from that simple act. I learned that we all have the power to make someone's life a little bit better. We all have the power to show up for each other even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "This foundation isn't about money, though money helps. It's about remembering that behind every cancer diagnosis there's a person, a family, dreams that are being threatened. And it's about saying you're not alone. We see you. We're here. Because that's what Elizabeth would have wanted. That's what anyone would want." The applause was warm and genuine, and Martha stepped back, relieved to be out of the spotlight. But James caught her hand and squeezed it. "You're amazing," he whispered. "You know that?" Martha shook her head, but she was smiling. The foundation took off faster than either of them expected. Within 3 months, they were helping 20 families. Within 6 months, it was 50. They paid for treatments, provided transportation to appointments, delivered meals, and offered counseling services. Martha insisted they also help with the small things that people forget about, like paying electric bills when someone was too sick to work, or providing childcare so parents could attend chemotherapy sessions. "It's the little things that break people," Martha explained to the board during one of their meetings. "When you're fighting for your life, you shouldn't also have to fight to keep your lights on." James had initially been uncomfortable with Martha attending board meetings, not because he didn't value her input, but because he worried the other board members, all wealthy business people, wouldn't take her seriously. He'd been wrong. Martha had a way of cutting through corporate speak and getting to the heart of what mattered. The other board members started looking to her for guidance, respecting her practical wisdom. One day, after a particularly long meeting, James drove Martha home. They'd started doing this regularly. He'd pick her up, they'd handle foundation business, and then he'd drop her off, often staying for dinner because Martha always insisted on feeding him. "You know," James said as they sat in traffic, "I've been thinking about something you said a while back, about how you've been leaving flowers on other neglected graves too." "Oh, that?" Martha said, a little embarrassed. "It's just something I do. When I see a grave that looks forgotten, I try to leave something, even just a single flower. Everyone deserves to be